What's the fastest growing church in the world? It's in Iran. Folks, in an article by Hudson.org, that's Hudson.org, titled God News from Iran. 1 million new Christian believers, as a commentary, by the way, written June 15th, 2023 by Leila Gilbert. She writes that Christianity is rapidly growing in Iran. This is very exciting because Iran's the top of the news, right? So today, through this article, I'm going to show you that Christianity is not dead, but only changing geographically to the east. And that, as my mentor, late Dr. Norman Geisler, used to say, Christians are like tea. The best flavors come out when the water is the hottest. Let's get started. Hey everybody, welcome back to Reason for Truth. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo. You know truth comes first, you have to, but then you back it up with all the reasons, because we're always and constantly learning. If we're not constantly learning, we're not teaching. We're at least not teaching well, and often that could mean not teaching truthfully. Listen, there's an explosive number of conversions of Christianity taking place. Where else? Iran, where an Islamist government has ruled since 1979. To the surprise of many, Christianity is flourishing. The implications, though, are potentially profound. We're going to talk about that. And the author of the article said, consider some testimonies. David Yegnazar of Elam Ministries stated in 2018 that the Iranians have become the most open people to the gospel. The Christian Broadcasting Network found also in 2018 that Christianity is growing faster in the Islamic Republic of Iran than any other country in the world. This is very exciting. This is 2023, and from my understanding, Iraq is starting to take off, and Afghanistan. All right, we'll get to that later. But listen, why is Christianity growing so rapidly in Iran? Well, the trend results from the extreme form of Shiite Islam imposed by theocratic regime. And an Iranian-Church leader explained how this kind of works in 2019. He said, what if I told you that the mosques are empty inside Iran? What if I told you no one follows Islam inside of Iran? What if I told you the best evangelist for Jesus was Ayatollah Khomeini, founder of the Islamic Republic? He just kind of poses those questions, but confirming these statements, a significant survey taken in 2020 by Gammon, a secular Netherlands-based research group, the report that there are far greater numbers of Christian believers in Iran than ever thought before, more than 1 million. And in fact, those involved with the house church movement in Iran are convinced that there are likely several million Christian believers there, more than just one, but several million. Evangelism, by the way, is alive, and it's in Iran. It's done more quietly in Iran as well than we would think in the West. New Christians witness to each other, and though through quiet conversations, their encouragement to one another, low profile, by the way, online Bible studies are prevalent, and they're affirmed by visions and dreams, and miraculously answered prayers. And I think that, when I was in seminary, if you said that God or Jesus shows up in dreams, they would say that's not true, but I believe that it is, because God, listen, no one's going to make a closed country. Say, okay, these countries are closed to the gospel. Well, they're closed in human terms. Jesus is going to walk through the door anyways, and that's the way he's doing it, in dreams quite often. Due to their risky circumstances, though, recent Christian converts are enthusiastically communicating about their changed lives with their friends and loved ones, but they're quietly and carefully doing that. However, their discreet but persistent witness accounts for the extraordinary number of Iranian believers multiplying, who meet in small house group churches, by the way. They don't go to the corner. There's no mega churches. They meet quietly in the house. Now, to tell you a little bit of how that works, these house churches are usually comprised of no more than 10 to 15 believers. In the past, I heard it when it started, it was no more than 5. But on any given day, they arrive one by one in a small apartment or some other nondescript location. As the last one enters, the door closes, it's locked. And they all take a deep breath, they relax, and they greet each other. I think biblically, with a kiss and a hug, the Persian and Middle Eastern, the way their hospitality is just so warm. But to be honest with you and I'm jealous a little bit of the authentic church of the faith of Iran, because their fellowship has to be very authentic. There's just no room for there's no such thing as cultural Christianity. It doesn't really exist there. It's very authentic. So I'm jealous again of the authentic Christian faith and sincere fellowship through their Persian brand of hospitality. A few minutes later, as they get started in their church and this little gathering they begin to do what? Sing quietly, very softly, accompanied by quietly strummed guitar. And they're actually cautious. They have to be, of course, not wanting their voices to be heard beyond the thin walls of the apartment. But soon, closed eyes and hands lifted heavenly. Listen, they're lost in praise and worship music and fellowship. And later in teaching from biblical passages offered, from communion service takes place quite often. And finally, after all the conversation, they leave one by one, very quietly. But this doesn't come without risk. The risk is very high. And in some house churches have continued for years without intrusion by government authorities, while others have been discovered and experienced devastating consequences. Sudden invasions by state authorities, usually the Islamic police or the religious police, can happen at any time. Everyone knows about Christian gatherings in which, without warning, a dozen or more officials burst into a small meeting and roughly arrest everyone there. Typically, these authorities also literally tear apart the residents, searching for laptops, phones, evangelistic publications, including things like Bibles and other books, DVDs, and videos. That's why when we see our podcast downloaded to Iran, you can assume that one download equals many. They'll put it on a thumb drive or a CD and they'll pass it around so that it keeps, very quiet. But the bottom line is, what are they looking for? Well, they're looking for anything they can confiscate that they'll label as evidence against the Christians. Arrests are made based on accusations such as insulting Islam or conducting deviant activity that contradicts or interferes with the sacred law of Islam. The house church participates in Iran, by the way, including recent converts. They know very well that the aftermath of such raids can be perilous. It can also include continued threats of violence, loss of their job, their employment, even expulsion from school or university, and have all their cash just confiscated, and even the endangerment of other family members, which I think is the worst. Everybody knows that sexual violence against mother, wife, girlfriend, or daughter is likely to follow. That's the scariest part. Still, with all this in mind, Iranian house churches, Christians, they continue. Christians are extraordinarily courageous in Iran, and sometimes the price they pay for their boldness is exceptionally painful. Prominent organizations who report on Iran's abuse of Christian believers, including the Vatican, Catholic Church, and several Protestant groups, they declare that the regime has recently increased its abuses, including surveillance, arrests, and imprisonment of house church leaders, including those who worship in their homes. But sadly, the true justice seldom follows, and the ministry Open Doors, you may have heard of those, acknowledge that their watchdog organization is appalled by the testimonies of violence due to the process took place in the courtrooms, including humiliating remarks from the judge, the court's unconcealed favor for the prosecutor's side, and the defendant's occasional lack of access to even a lawyer, and verdicts issued in less than 10 days, clearly without sufficient consideration or evidence. Now you ready for the great news? Iran is now sending out evangelists to where? Afghanistan. They're doing what the U.S. military, not to say the individual, but the government of the United States tried to do with bombs. I think that the Iranian Christians are going to do with the power of God, because God's more powerful than any and all militaries. But listen, Iran is now sending out evangelists to Afghanistan. Neighboring Afghanistan rivals Iran as the fastest growing church. I love that competition, influenced by none other than the Iranian Christians themselves, who speak a similar language, similar cultural connections. They have built bridges for the spread of the gospel. It's the way God works, man. I'm just telling you, you can't stop God. It doesn't matter what these feeble little leaders who are bullies do. God always wins in the end. God used the Armenian, the Chaldean, and Assyrian churches as a source of light, especially in the early years after the revolution, for Iranians who became disillusioned with the Islamic Republic and were searching for answers. Though these communities number inside the country, they had dwindled down to about maybe 100,000 people at most, believers, and the number of new Iranian converts has surpassed in as much as 10 times, at least 1 million, right? 100,000 times 10, you got 1 million. Christianity is growing in Iran, though, through believers simply telling their friends, their family, just about their newfound faith. House church movements have begun pop up all over in Iran, as we stated, providing deep fellowship that has helped many Iranian believers to remain firm in their faith amid great persecution. Now, these converts come from all sectors of society. It's not just the poor. It's actually the poor, middle class, and the rich. from street vendors to taxi cab drivers to intellectuals to artists, even public servants. How about that? That's AKA government workers. How about that? House churches, online media gospels programs, and person-to-person connections continue to be conduits of the spread of the gospel all over the country, and that's great news. Now, listen, while persecution has threatened to eliminate Christianity from Iran, the opposite has happened, which always happens, and that persecution only seems to spur the growth of the church. That's just what happens. It happens in China, and it's going to happen in the United States, by the way, when the cultural Christians kind of get out of the way, they get the fat gets cut off the bone and they get down to the meat, right? Real Christians, in other words, stand up for what they believe. Now remember, Christians are like tea. The best flavors come out when the water's the hottest. In other words, Christianity atrophies. It declines in good, easy times, but it grows and expands in the difficult times of persecution. Leads us to answer the big question, so what, Steve? What's the lesson for me, for you and I today? I don't live in Iran. I don't live 1,000 years ago. I live today. So is that despite abuses suffered by our sisters and brothers in Iran, we should be inspired. We should be awestruck by their faith, their courage, their boldness, and by the remarkable results of their steadfast faith, evident by the fact that there are more than 1 million new converts, called at least 1 million, if not multiple millions, called Muslim background believers. This is a term that came out a long while ago. They're called MBBs, Muslim background believers. These MBBs are reading the Bible for the first time, praying, gathering in small groups, and sharing their new faith with friends and family, despite the risks. Their faith is amazing. It's real. It's encouraging, and it's inspiring. So how we see Iran ought to be different than what the media headlines tell us. Today we see Iran in the headlines. We're wise to be concerned. Let's pray for God's intervention into the regime's deadly intentions, militarily and governmentally, Islamically speaking. But let's also remember this little known but rapidly growing family inside Iran's borders. That's our family of God. Their bold example of courage in the face of persecution shines brightly amidst ever-increasing darkness in the Middle East. So in conclusion, I want to encourage you to rejoice in that the church is growing throughout the world, especially Iran. And while the state of the church in America is falling apart in great part, not all churches, but many, God will not be stopped. Christianity never grows in the good times, but through the persecution and the difficult times. Listen, it's similar to history of America. When immigrants come to America, historically, they work hard, in the past anyways. They work long hours, understanding the value of the opportunity that's been given them to not only make money, but to live freely. So in most cases, family businesses last, by the way, only maybe 3 generations. Then the wealth is passed on to their children and their children. And then what happens? All that money gets eventually dissipates and family wealth is not used or properly. Most of that has to do with people, when they have a lot of money that their parents or their grandparents made, they just don't really have to work hard for it. And what happens, it's similar to our faith. When we take our faith for granted, it becomes a cultural thing. So our Christian faith is no different in that Christians in the West, especially the United States, I don't mind saying this, have come to see our church and our Christian faith as a social event, a networking venue, culturally norm thing to do for the simple fact that it doesn't cost us anything. And the truth is that when something costs nothing, the value of that thing doesn't exist or it goes way down, right? Just like the US dollar being printed up too much. Our Christian faith is no exception. We need to be praying for our brothers and sisters in Iran and the Middle East. And as Christians, we should also be jealous of them because their faith is real. It's valuable, vibrant, and joyful. So as we read the headlines, don't despair, but be joyful. Why? Because the great news is that Christianity is not dead in the world, but only changing geographically to the east. And remember the words of my dear friend and mentor, the late Dr. Norman Geisler, Christians are like tea. The best flavors come out when the water is the hottest. Now, as we learn to live out the Christian faith, no matter where you're at in the world, because this podcast is broadcast internationally. I see the statistics all over every continent. I want you to go to Equipped Academy for some online training. If that's something that you can't afford, we've made it very affordable. But if you can't, you reach out to us. There's a contact button on the Reason for Truth website. We'll look into it. We'll qualify you. If it looks, internationally, we'll go ahead and provide that for no cost for you. How about that? But we appreciate that. I wanted to equippedacademy.com, or you can just go to christianonlinetraining.com. Either one of those will take you to equippedacademy.com. It's pretty cool. Anyways, appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you do a couple things because you don't want to miss any of these. Make sure you share this with others. You like and subscribe. Bam! Gonzalo Sinistro. Knock out that subscribe button. We'll see you at the next episode. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo, and this is your Reason for Truth for today.